By far, one of the most distinctive voices in KTIB history was Hugh Smith, a well-versed broadcaster and possibly even better engineer. Let's listen to his wide-ranging radio career. Hugh Smith, how you doing this evening?
Fine, and yourself?
Very well. Well, let's start from the beginning. Where are you from originally?
Originally? A little town in Arkansas, about 65 miles south of Memphis, right on the Mississippi River. Town of Helena.
Helena, Arkansas.
Correct.
All right. Well, was getting into broadcasting always an interest of yours growing up?
Not really. It was sort of dropped in my lap during World War II. During my senior year in high school in 1942. I did some part-time work for the station there. And when I graduated, I had taken off in another direction and decided I didn't care for that. And I was contacted again and offered a position at the station, which I accepted and grew into 45 years.
Wow, it's a pretty long time in the business. Coming from Arkansas, did you work at a lot of different stations before you came down to KTIB?
Oh, yes. In fact, KTIB was the second from the end of my career.
Wow.
Prior to that, I was all over the United States, I guess you might say, including work for the 4 major networks.
Wow, that must have been pretty rewarding work right there.
In a way, it was. Then I learned that you couldn't eat, wear, or sleep with glory. So I reoriented myself in later years into engineering, which is another whole story.
All righty, no problem. Well, how did you first get hooked up with the folks at KTIB?
I was in my bedroom in Monroe, Louisiana, one evening preparing to go to sleep, because I had the early shift the next morning, beginning at 5 o'clock at KMLB in Monroe, northeast Louisiana. I received a telephone call, and we chatted for 10, 15 minutes. And I was offered the job as chief engineer at KTIB by Bob Mahaffey, who was manager at that time. He said I had been highly recommended. However, he declined to tell me who recommended me. At any rate, I didn't indicate much of an interest until he said, well, what would it take to move you down here? Well, I flipped a figure at him, figuring that would be the end of it. And to my great surprise, he went silent for about 30 seconds and said, well, that's feasible. And he talked me into coming down to look over Thibodeau, bringing my wife, and we did go and spend the weekend. We met with the 3 owners at that time in the old First Federal building, which is now the sheriff's office there in Thibodeau. And the station was located there at that time. And they persuaded me to come on and accept the job.
Okay, and what was the first year that you worked at KTIB?
I came down in November of 1968.
1968. So it probably wasn't too long after that the station moved to its offices in Green Street, correct?
Right, that was my first major project there. In the following winter and spring, they were building your present studios atop the Young Men's Business Club, I think they call it. And as soon as they built a studio and got it to the point that we could move in, I shut the station down at its regular sundown sign-off time. It was daytime only then. And we began to move it. I had the entire staff directing them and a part-time engineer from Block Furniture Store who's TV repairman, Martin. So we moved that station studio overnight into the present building, went on the air at the regular time of 6 a.m.
Well, I take it out was probably some real hard work in those few hours.
Definitely, that's and a lot of confusion, running about 10 miles of wire in through the wall. So it was quite I had pre-wired a bunch of it as much as I could prior to that particular move. But there's always 10 million details to be taken care of in a move like that.
Okay. Tell me, how long was your tenure at KTIB?
About 5 years.
5 years, so about 60 to 73.
Correct. When the 3 three owners announced that they were selling the station. I didn't exactly know what to do, and the purchaser, Ray Sadie, had called me, and we could not quite get together. And about that time, KCIL called and asked me the same question that I had been asked to come to KTIB. So that opportunity opened, and I retired from KCIL, KTIN.
You're at KTIB. Did you work with Marie Bergeron?
I did. Marie is a wonderful person. I have the heart for her abilities as a radio lady.
Very much so. I'd like to also ask you about your working relationship with the three owners, Mr. Block, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Larson. Take it to 5 years you're at KTIB. It must have been a pretty good working relationship with them.
I think so. However, by the very nature of three different individuals, you were pulled in three different directions. No harm intended by the three owners, but I was constantly pulled in three directions, and it was very difficult to try to strike a course that was satisfactory to all three of them at any one given time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was as I became station manager within the course of that 5 years.
I'd like to also ask you about another gentleman who I believed was at KTIB when you were here, Jim Swiler.
Jim Swiler, he was here a few months. I was station manager after Bob Mahaffey had resigned, and Bob went into New Orleans with an advertising agency, I believe. Jim was in New Orleans at that time, wanting to come back to Thibodeau, and Jim stayed with us for, I think, about a year. As manager, when he left, it fell into my lap.
Okay. I'd like to ask about another gentleman who spoke of you very highly before I first hooked up with you, Rick Luquette.
Ricky, yes, Rick did work with us, and he was quite capable. And he later went with Ray City at KHOM.
Mm-hmm. Also, I believe another gentleman who worked with you, I think it would have been for the first few months the last few months of your tenure, John Rayner.
Yes, John Rayner, when I hired him, he was in high school. In fact, he was so young, I think about 16. I had to get him a work permit before I could hire him and train him. He was very satisfactory, a very dedicated young man.
In all the years you worked at KTIB and KCIL as well, did you have any real difficult chores you were asked to do when it was come to either maintenance or repair?
Well, yes. The equipment was in fair shape when I came to KTIB. I whipped it into shape. The FM station was particularly bad, and that it was up and down the weekend that they had asked me to come down and interview for the job. I went out and looked at the FM station. They had Mr. Martin, who I think is now deceased, working, and the engineer at that time, I have forgotten his name. But anyway, he had to resign and take on another job. But anyway, I corrected the situation at the FM station, and that's what firmed up the decision for the owners to meet my salary request.
There was one gentleman, though, I definitely need to ask you about, because I'm pretty sure he started at KTIB during your tenure before moving on to New Orleans Television, Ken Berthelot.
Yes, I hired Ken fresh out of radio school. And he later went to the home and television station, which shut down, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And from there to several other places. And the last I heard him, he was working football, I believe, for Tulane University.
Oh, that's right. The voice of Tulane Radio for many, many years, in fact.
Right.
Now, I understand when you left and moved over to KCIL that one of the tasks you had to do over there, didn't you have to rebuild their tower?
That was a bulldozer situation. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, man, you must have been out of your mind to accept this job. In the years that I was there, the owner at the time, Denver Brennan, passed away. His son, Tom Brennan, inherited the station. And Tom, I must say, even though he was a bit abrasive at times. We managed to get along, but he did invest the money to completely rebuild the operation. And I got new equipment for transmitter and studio plants. And last major construction project there was increasing KTIB-AM from 3,000 watts to its present 100,000 watts.
Wow, pretty huge undertaking, to say the least.
It was indeed.
All righty. I'd like to also go back with something at KTIB, because one thing a lot of my friends and family told me about you was you probably had one of the most pronounced voices the station had ever had. I take it when you first got into radio, did you have to go into any kind of training to get such a quality voice?
Well, I appreciate your comment there in describing my voice. No, I'm afraid not. At that time, in 1942, radio schools were practically non-existent, and those who were teaching radio had about the same amount of experience that I had. So you might say my entire career was self-taught, self-generated.
Oh, okay, very interesting.
That includes engineering.
Wow. Now that's definitely an accomplishment right there. To basically self-teach yourself engineering is probably a bigger undertaking than rebuilding a tower.
Yes, very much so. At that time, we had to have the first-class engineer's license from the FCC before we could even watch up the transmitter plant. They did have a third-class license at that time in the 1940s and early 50s, which later they dropped and went back to requirement of the first-class license.
Okay. Oh,
it was quite complicated to learn, memorize it, and then start applying the knowledge into practical experience.
Wow, very much so. Folks that worked at KTIB when you were there, one gentleman who's currently a producer at Channel 4 Television, Todd Bauer.
Yes, Todd was here too. He was here at the time Jim Swiler was. He was one of the announcing personnel.
Right, and also one gentleman that was at KTIB, wow, probably going on 40 years, Leroy Martin.
Leroy Martin, yes. An institution in Lafourche Parish, and I trust still is.
Oh, very much so.
As the assessor?
Yes, longtime assessor. Now his son has that title. I take it he was probably one of the more interesting characters you'd ever want to meet.
Leroy?
Yeah.
Yes, he and the entire band that he had, Van Bruce and all of the others, they were wonderful guys and real easy to work with and a lot of fun to work with.
I take it also in your tenure at KTIB, did you also do a lot of read a lot of news as well?
I did.
A lot of commercials too?
Oh yes, the general routine.
General routine as always. Spinning records and...
I did that too, and I even swept the floors occasionally.
I want you to tell everybody, and I thought this was one of the more interesting stories you had mentioned to me. Tell everybody a story about when the day you decided to leave broadcasting.
Well, that I got to the point that I was burned out totally after 45 years, 33 years of which I was the chief engineer at the particular station for which I was working at in a given moment, which title was quite ludicrous because I was the only engineer. At any rate, I was totally burned out, and I got to work each morning. I would say, Lord, show me the way out of this. All at once one day, he hit me over the head and said, well, you have the money, go for it. So I walked into KCIL to the station manager, Ken Winstanley at that time. I said, Ken, at the end of business today, I am retired.
Wow. Plain and simple.
Plain and simple. He said, boy, you give a man a lot of notice, don't you? I said, well, let's reverse that, Ken. If you were going to fire me, how much notice would you give me?
Very true.
He said, touche. So anyway, we parted on amicable terms, and I have retired totally ever since. Have not walked into a radio station since October 1st, 1987.
Have you done any other kinds of work since then?
None whatsoever.
So you're just enjoying retirement?
Totally.
How long have you been living out of state now?
You mean out of Louisiana?
Right.
Since 1996. let's see, I had to stop and think, since January of 1996.
Wow. So hopefully it sounds like life is going pretty well for you.
I guess after I retired, my wife and I had worked earlier in radio in Biloxi, Mississippi, at WLOX, which doesn't exist as that call letter. At any rate, my wife and I always came back to the coast every time we got a vacation. So when I retired, my mother was in a nursing home there in Thibodeau, and I couldn't move her. I was sort of tied there until she passed away in the fall of 1995. And then immediately we found a place here on the coast that we liked very much, 3 blocks from the beach. And we bought it, and we've been here ever since.
All right. Well, I tell you what, Hugh Smith, we greatly appreciate your time in this interview as part of our anniversary series. And before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to all our listeners?
Yes. Les bon temps roulés.
Hugh Smith, a quality and skilled member of KTIB's first 50 years. The late